Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series on Office 365 and e-discovery. This is Tom O'Connor of the Gulf Coast Legal Technology Center in New Orleans, and I am joined, as always, by Rachi Messing of the Rachi is the Senior Program Manager at Microsoft Legal. Rachi, how are you doing today?
Today I'm doing great.
Good. Good. We're really going to start to get into the area now where what you folks are doing with Office 365 is a little different from the traditional EDRM management system or workflow. We've talked so far about litigation holds and information governance. And as the EDRM, which is displayed up on the screen for you to reference, then starts to proceed, you look at the documents and then get into the areas of preservation, then going out and collecting them and processing them, getting them ready for whatever review tool you're going to use. And each of those steps, that preservation, collection, and processing, are indeed separate steps in EDRM simply because of the nature of the world of documents we've had for so long. Documents residing in different systems that have to be gathered into one place, processed in terms of making them ready for review in some standardized format. Things are much, much different in the Office 365 world, as you would expect, because of the fact that, in fact, they are already in an operating system. And so this individual method or means, the individual steps of collection and processing are not really necessary. So I'm going to turn this over to Rachi to explore what really to me is a great step forward, because as many of you know, and Rachi will talk about, these individual steps, although it's great that they've been identified and we've taken gone to great lengths over the years to set up systems to deal with them, still involve moving data around. And in today's world of e-discovery, moving large amounts of data around from one program to another, often from one site to another, in order to do that. And that involves, as you would expect, and I'm sure some of you would have experienced, all the issues in terms of lag in delivery, in downloading or transferring or FTPing terabytes of data. And then the secondary issues, or connected issues, if you will, certainly not secondary, of concern with security and the intrinsic data integrity of all that data and moving it around. So Rachi, why don't you take us into Office 365 and show us what's different now? How has Microsoft addressed this issue?
Absolutely. So, I think that's a great point in terms of the fact that things are different. The approach is different, namely because of the fact that the data itself is staying in place, right? It's staying in Office 365 in the environment in which it lives. And because of that, even some of the basics steps of the EDRM, like the processing step that we're going to talk through, the collection step, they're not really necessary in a lot of ways, because historically, and Tom, you've dealt with plenty of cases that have had this, when it came time to figure out what data was going to actually be looked at by the attorneys, was going to get reviewed, the only way to do that was to forklift the data over to somewhere that I could actually index it, right, process it, extract all that text out, get it ready in an indexed form in order that then I could search it, in order that then I could cull it down, right?
I think I love the phrase forklift. That's a great description of what we've come to. As you know, Rachi, 10, 12 years ago, the data sets, although not necessarily small, we're certainly nowhere near the stage that or the level that we have now. The problem has been that, now with these massive data sets, we literally need an electronic forklift to move this data around.
Yeah, we've seen at Microsoft, we've seen the data grow by over 20 times over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
On a per custodian basis. So, it's just massive amounts of data to be moving around. So the way that Office 365 approaches it is the data when it's sitting in Office 365, by default, the vast majority of that data is already searchable. The same way that when you're in Outlook, or you're in a Word document, or you're looking in your OneDrive or wherever it might be, and you run a keyword search to search your email, or you run a search to find all the emails that Tom sent to Rachi. I can do that in Outlook, right? Well, the reason why I can do that is because that data is all indexed. That index allows us on the eDiscovery side to also search that data without having to pull that data out and re-index it. So when I go ahead and I add, like we did last time in the last session that we did, we added the custodians here, right? Yep. And we said these are the custodians that we are going to be dealing with in this case. Well, one of the things that it does is it says, okay, I know that the vast majority of the data is searchable already. But I also know that there might be some data that's not searchable yet, right? It could be that I've got data that someone sent me from another company and they password protected it or they encrypted it, and Office 365 doesn't have that password or doesn't have a way to decrypt that data, right? That data is not going to be searchable. It could be that it's a file format which Office 365 doesn't index, because data, while we're able to obviously handle all of the kind of standard file formats, the Word documents, Excels, PowerPoints, PDF files, text files, all kinds of different files by default are able to be indexed, and the text is already quote unquote extracted. But there are going to be certain file types which are not. So if we do come across those file types, then from an eDiscovery perspective, we still have a responsibility, even though from an end user perspective, maybe it's not so important that those are going to be searchable, or it's not going to have as much of an impact if they're not searchable. But from an eDiscovery perspective, we want to make sure that that data is going to be searchable. So when I add someone as a custodian, one of the things that it does is it actually will kick off a job that will go through all of their email, all of their OneDrive data, any sources that we identified when we added them as a custodian, and it'll add them to an additional index. So this is called the deep indexing here. So,
and Rachi, yeah. let me just be clear. When you say it kicks it off, this is being done automatically.
Correct.
Great. Correct.
So when I add that custodian and they get listed here, it automatically will kick off that job, and that job will take any of the data that we weren't able to index by default in Office 365, and it uses some deeper processing in order to index those files. Basically, it's kind of like a more expensive processing process. So we don't want to do it by default on all data in all of Office 365, because the vast majority of that data is never going to have to be searched. So we only do it on the data that actually has to be searched for a specific case. So when I add the custodians, it's important to know that it is going to go through that processing of extracting the text out of, and as well as all the metadata, out of any of those other file types, and adding them to the index so that when we get up to our next session or on searching, then I'm going to be able to search not just the things that are by default searchable, but also anything that wasn't by default searchable, but now has been added into that deep index. That make sense?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. So when I go ahead, I've added the custodians, and you can see that I added them on March 11th here. It updated the index for each of them. So all of their data is actually indexed. I can go over to the processing tab to see if there were any issues around these custodians. And we can see here that actually there's nothing in this set of data that the deep index wasn't able to handle. I'm also going to show you quickly here, this is in another case where I've actually added some data which did have some issues where deep indexing wasn't able to handle it. And I can see very quickly that I've got that data sorted out where I can see different aspects of why wasn't that data able to be added to the deep index. Sometimes it's because the files are corrupt. Sometimes it's a file type that's not supported, like a PNF file. Chances are it's probably some programming file or something that we actually aren't going to be able to get any text out of it. But from a defensibility standpoint, you need to be able to report on all of those different files that weren't able to be handled in processing, as well as I could come over here and say, you know what, I want to take all of these files that were not supported and I want to do an error remediation on them. And the error remediation, I already kicked off an error remediation, sorry. In this case, let me go back. The error remediation will actually allow me to go in and download all of those files that I've identified that I want to try to fix. So for example, if they were password protected files, I can supply the password to them, I can decrypt them, I can look at these files that aren't supported and figure out maybe they're a custom file type that I need to do something differently with. And then I can upload them back into the system. So that way the text of them will get indexed and then they just get added into that master index for this case.
Great.
So from an office, when you compare it to the EDRM process where I was basically pulling out all of the email, all of the data for these custodians and running the text extraction on everything, and still dealing with any of the errors, any of the password protected files, anything like that, I still have to deal with those. Now we've limited it to only having to deal with separately those few files that may have an issue. And in a lot of cases, such as the one that we're working on right now, you won't even have any error files that need to be dealt with. So again, from a Office 365 collection standpoint, we're not really collecting the data, right? We're not actually moving it onto hard drives or sending it out somewhere, copying it to file shares, anything like that. All we're doing is we're identifying which custodians, which users have the data that we're potentially interested in. We're going ahead and we're saying, we want to make sure that any of their specific user-related data, their OneDrive, their email, as well as any shared resources that they've identified through custodian interviews or other processes, to say that these are the sources that we want to make sure that we're going to be able to search. And now that data is just ready to go without having to move it. It's secure, it's still in the system. And it's a lot faster because we're not pulling that data out, we're not copying it, we're not having to run it through the processing tools. That data is going to be available to go ahead and do the searches a lot faster in the process. So, Tom, I think that probably sums up the processing and collection steps here for Office 365 e-discovery. I mean, it's really simplified it from a pretty complex, a complex and very detailed process to one that's just able to be done on a case-by-case basis simply within the interface.
I agree. That's the fact that you could even explain that in 15 minutes is a whole lot easier than what we've been going through. A couple of quick questions, though, Rachi. So first, just a little bit more, if you will, about that error. Is that the error readout there? Is that an actual log? Is that a file? How is that done?
So the error remediation process, let me go back here. So everything that's done within the case is logged. So when you added those custodians and it went through and created the deep index, then any files that were not able to be added by default get added here to this screen, which is basically a log of any of the files that had errors.
Right.
Once you remediate them, then they won't appear on this screen because they'll just be part of the indexed data within the case. They're still part of the audit log, so I can still track back everything that I did, but they won't appear here on the error remediation screen. So,
two sub questions then about this. You mentioned audio or video files. When you say video, I automatically think video/audio. Are those? How are those handled?
So they are actually handled within the system in regards to the fact that you can view them. So when we get to the review piece where we're actually going to look at data, I can see them, I can listen to them, I can play the videos. Right. If they've got extracted text along with them, the transcript that's been, for example, these recordings that we're making, we're actually doing them using an Office 365 technology, and they will actually have a transcript that gets generated behind the scenes together with it. So I can then index that transcript and make that searchable to be able to identify things within the video. So those files are handled. It's not, a default. It's not going to go through all of the audio and all the video if it doesn't have a transcript. So it's not like by the images where it will OCR them by default, but audio and video today, it will not automatically create a transcript. I think that's something that the team is probably looking at putting in at some point in time. But if it does have a transcript available with it, that transcript will get indexed.
So every statement, I think of two more questions. So a video, let's say, with no transcript, is that going to show up in this error log, or are they just passed over since they're not being indexed, but there's nothing wrong with them? What happens with that?
So they're not going to be flagged as an error,
right?
Because it will pull out all the metadata on them, and it'll identify that it's a video type. You can later on segregate them if you want to be able to, for example, just export those separately, but they're not going to actually be flagged as errors.
Gotcha. The ones that have a transcript, is there a link between the transcript and the audio or the video? That is to say, no. If I'm reading something, will it jump over? No.
No, today, unfortunately, it's not quite up to that yet.
Oh yeah. Well, that was under the heading of wishful thinking, especially for my friends at the Federal Defender's Office, who that's a huge ongoing need for them. So I just wanted to make sure that I asked.
Yeah.
What about, and we may talk about this some other place in another one of our segments, but what about documents that are not Office 365 documents? Is that something you want to address now, or do we leave that to a different day?
Let's talk about that when we get up to the working sets, because there is a process with the working sets to add non-Office 365 data into the case.
Yes.
So we'll walk through that process a little bit later.
Right.
But it's of course it's important, since today's topic is collections. It is obviously important to have that process to actually gather that data together. So if you've got data that's still sitting on someone's laptop and hasn't been synced up to OneDrive, or if it's file share data that's been collected, or some other source, it could be text messages that you've collected. And we won't talk today about how to collect those. But if you've collected them, you can actually bring them and join them with the rest of your data here.
Great. And again, I agree. We don't want to get into that now. I wanted to at least throw it out there though, because I can hear people scratching on our computer screens right now saying, what if I'm running Office 365? So I think that's great. Just let people know we are aware of that and we will address that issue. We still will have 3 or 4 more of these modules to go. I should remind people that we're trying to adhere to a schedule of classes that were given to us by Judge Xavier Rodriguez, who sits in the federal court in San Antonio and teaches a course at the St. Mary's Law School, also in San Antonio. He gave us a list of his classes that cover specific topics, and so we're trying to stick as much as we can to that, even though the workflow in Office 365, as Rachi just explained, is a little different than traditional EDRM workflow. So we will return to those subjects down the line as we do some more modules for Judge Rodriguez and his classes. Anything else you'd want to address on this though today, Rachi?
Other than the fact that I think as a corporate member of an e-discovery team, this process makes so much more sense to us, and it's not just the elements that you mentioned in terms of the errors and the security, but there's a cost component to it also, because of the fact that we don't have to take all that data out and send it to get indexed and processed and have it searched and hosted and all of those things. It has a cost component that really makes e-discovery a lot more affordable. It makes the entire process one that's able to actually be sustained even as that data continues to grow and grow and grow and grow.
Great. Well, Rachi, thanks so much. This is, to me, is really part of the really exciting part of what Microsoft is doing here, because we can cut down, as we said at the onset, on those handling and moving of large data sets, which is becoming troublesome from several perspectives, not just the time of delivery to do that, but the security and data integrity concerns. So I appreciate this. We look forward to talking to everyone in our next component. Thanks, Rachi.
Thanks, Tom.